White Haskell Haltisquist Sukuikist. I'm very honored and grateful that the organizers of this very important event and gathering invited me to help and assist in moderating this morning's panel. And starting off with this panel has a lot of meaning, as we know, in terms of the Indigenous and settler relationships, primarily in Canada, but all over Turtle Island in the world. And that's what I really appreciate about Slow Foods and Slow Foods International and my friend Alicia. What a nice surprise to have you here. I was at the AGA last year in Montreal, and it's so good to see everybody again, and the community that's growing under Slow Foods, and the work of Slow Foods International and our communities and all our efforts in terms of fostering healthy, vibrant communities and environments through the work of food systems. And so that brings the panel this morning in terms of shared perspectives on Indigenous food systems, what that may mean by these panelists that are joining us this morning, and what our communities are doing in the important work of how traditional food systems or Indigenous food systems contribute and have an impact and a real value in terms of not only the future, but the present today in ensuring our children, generations to come, will have healthy, vibrant lives as well. And thus that relationship with our land and our place in our relationship with the land and the space that we occupy with all living things, how we impact that relationship in those responsibilities as Indigenous peoples in our work. And so part of that work is our philosophical or our spiritual or cultural worldviews. And with Slow Foods and the values of clean, fair, and good, of course, how can I forget good? I have found in my own experience how that integration and complement of those values are so key and core to Indigenous worldviews as well. So I see a very conducive fit in that work of the Slow Foods organization and that of Indigenous communities. However, that context, as we know, has been quite disrupted in terms of colonization and other impacts throughout our history. So this morning, the shared perspectives of these beautiful women who I feel very humbled to be a part of and sitting here will share some of those insights with you this morning. And they will be speaking to that intention of what they have been committed to do in their personal and professional lives to highlight the need of Indigenous and traditional knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, as some say, and describe how important it is to the food systems of our regions and of our homes and of our territories in which we live. So I would like to start with our guest that I believe came the farthest from Quebec.
Yes, Quebec.
Yes. Okay, if you want to introduce yourself.
Irene Nipashan Singason, Quebec Nochin, Inon Skanashan. Greetings, my name is Irene Nipash. I'm from Northern Quebec with the Cree Nation of Waswanipi. My community is a small Cree community which basically has 9 Cree communities, and we are the most southern Cree community in Northern Quebec. So our community right now is considered fairly well developed compared to other First Nations communities in Quebec. This came in effect from the,
Speak a little louder.
a little louder.
Yes, yes. If you want to be standing.
Maybe if you feel comfortable standing, it might project your voice a bit more.
Oh, yeah.
This is a historic house and it's quite a.
Yes, and my voice doesn't travel that well too. Sorry about that in the back.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems to help.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay.
Yes, so, yeah, we are the most southern community, and the challenges we face with regards to food sovereignty are highly influenced by the fast food industry. So in my studies at Carleton University, I took food politics. I'm actually nowhere in the kitchen, I'm not on a farm, I'm quite the opposite from what you people stand for here. I'm in policy. I'm in economic development for First Nations. However, the reality of my family being hit with diabetes, over half of my family has diabetes. I've lost many relatives to the complications of diabetes and so forth. We have an epidemic of obesity and so forth. These realities have influenced the direction that my education was taking. So in taking food politics, my passion always been economic development, and I've come across the slow food movement and was just extremely fascinated by the philosophy of the slow food movement. I've come to see that the slow food movement is actually something that can help my people preserve the culinary component of our culture, and also find a way to bring about more self-sustaining economic development. Because right now our communities are defined by the funding received from external sources. So there's no self-determination in that process. It's crippling our people, causing a dependency syndrome, and this doesn't help when you're trying to address the issues of diabetes and so forth. So the work that I've done, I've had the opportunity to speak at events on economic development for First Nations, because I'm in policy, but I'm not in politics. So I refuse to associate or affiliate myself with the political side. So I come as an individual in economic development. So I'm able to say, hey people, we need to take charge here. Let's get our act together. Let's get ourselves organized. You know, let's define what it is we want to do and what it is we want to achieve for our people. And let's not wait for the funding to come in with a set of policies that tells us, this is what you're going to do with the money, this is what you can do with the money. That's, you know, so the message is being well received. But it's a delicate issue when it comes to culture. So the reality of the delicateness of trying to tackle the issue of how do we protect our culture, the culinary component of our culture, and create an economic system that allows our people to be self-sustaining is very delicate. I'll have people that are for the culture that'll tell me, you're basically doing what the white man did, you know, you're trying to monetize our culture. But in reality, the discussion needs to take place with regards to how do we incorporate our traditional foods into our existing economy. Whether it's financial transactions, or is it just going to be traditional transactions? Right now, it's highly based on traditional transactions. If I buy a rabbit from my neighbor who's a hunter, my mom is not happy with me giving this young hunter $15 for the rabbit. She says I'm going against the culture, but in my philosophy, I believe that this young man comes to my house and gives me a rabbit, but he goes home to his 5 children. He lives in a house. He needs gas for his skidoo to go check his snares. He has to buy the snares. He has to get somebody to take care of the children while he's out and feed his children. So there's a gap right now that exists in the traditional way that we're approaching food and with regards to being a self-sustaining nation. So that discussion is, like I said, it's being received, but the two extremes continuously clash. So I'm here in hopes of being able to meet people that have begun the process of looking at this and how do they go about incorporating their traditional or regional foods into their local economies. Has their work been done with regards to preserving the cultural aspect of regional cuisine? Because it is part of a culture. There's a lot of work being done on preserving the culture, the arts and crafts, the language, and so forth, but the culinary part seems to be left behind. So, yeah, that's pretty much my work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A very interesting perspective to keep in mind. And questions and answering discussion will happen at the end, just so you all know there'll be some space for that, as well as we hear from our presenters. And I'd like to introduce Don Morrison now, co-founder of the Indigenous Food Systems Network of BC. Oh.
Hello, can you hear me?
Wow.
There we go. That was for me.
Okay, White Hohwada. I've just greeted you all in my Secwepemc language. I've said hello, everyone. And before I start, I want to just express gratitude for the local Secwepemc Shuswap Indian Band and the Tunaha people who have taken care of this place for many, many thousands of years. And just honor the ancestors of this land. It's a very, very sacred place. I can feel it. And this work that we're doing here is sacred work. And none of it would be possible without honoring all of the rich, just the sacredness of this place, each place that we're in. And so I will start by saying that I am Secwepemc. My mother is Bernice August, and my late grandparents Edith Sewell from the Adams Lake Indian Band, which is part of the Secwepemc Inn by Adams Lake. And my grandfather was Nisconnet Indian Band by Nisconnet Lake in and around Chase and Salmon Arm. I know that we have a lot of kinship ties to the people in this place, but I'm not as well informed on that, and I'm just learning. I'm just decolonizing myself because I am an intergenerational survivor or a survivor of intergenerational impacts of Indian residential school, and that's largely what brings me to this work. So I'm going to share just a little bit of my personal story, but I want to talk more about the work and how it's connected. I feel grateful for what Irene brought, because it's a nice lead into the work that we're doing with the BC Food Systems Network and the working group on Indigenous food sovereignty that I am the director of right now. And Suzanne Johnson will be speaking. She's also a member of the working group. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year, and so that's a pretty major feat. We've started up within the network. We followed the model of the BC Food Systems Network, which is an amazing kind of network that got really organized, and it really helped us to provide a model of how we can organize in Indigenous communities around food and food sovereignty specifically. So the way that we work as a working group is very, very much, it's not your typical Robert's Rules kind of organization. It's very much been organic in the way it was formed. And I'm here speaking on behalf of the working group, but I'm also I think it's really important because food is very political, as Pauline mentioned, that I'm not here to represent the whole Secwepemc Nation, and I'm not here to represent every Indigenous nation. It's much too diverse to be able to say that any one of us can do that. I do honor my Secwepemc heritage, but I also have Irish and Scottish heritage, and I'm learning about the Indigenous ways of those peoples as well, and I'm just decolonizing my thinking around that as well, because many of the Irish and Scottish people suffered the same kind of social issues around the oppressive colonization, effects of colonization in their homeland. Now we're in this big global food system, this global reality that has very much dispossessed Indigenous peoples and everywhere that colonization has traveled around the world. And a lot of that has also followed the time frame where plants and animals were first domesticated 10, 11,000 years ago, if you follow kind of that linear kind of history. So really the domestication of plants and animals led to the colonial expansion, which led to the establishment of a legal doctrine and a cultural hierarchy that dispossessed or made Indigenous peoples inferior, especially with regards to the hunting, the fishing, the gathering. That still persists to this day as some of the most sustainable adaptation strategies of humanity. So about 2/3 of all North American tribes are hunters, fishers, and gatherers, and we don't fit neatly into the techno-bureaucratic framework that was established at the introduction of agrarianism in the late 1800s, or the production model that was pretty much instituted in the Industrial Revolution. So I too really appreciate Slow Food's values, core values. I've been involved with a lot of cross-cultural work, and within the conversations with the BC Food Systems Network, and Heather has also been a part of watching us grow, and a part of the conversations that's informed the methodology, and that's, for lack of a better term, it's basically a framework we've developed, and it's that cross-cultural conversation has helped me to do my research on Indigenous food systems, and I've looked at a lot of like anthropological literature, not just my people, but other academics and people around the world who have been analyzing the food system and critiquing the productionist model and promoting a more regenerative food system, like based on a holistic health model, as opposed to a linear kind of mechanistic producer, consumer, distributor kind of. So with that, I've been really applying the framework to conversations to develop a new language and terminology and new tools for people, for us to come together across cultures, to start to tell a different story about the food system. So we're all here doing good work. We're all here wanting to have a more sustainable, to chart a new path in the global food system that's more sustainable, because we know right now that the corporate control of the food system and the way it's going is unsustainable. I think none of us can argue that. We're all in this together. We all have, past experiences that are diverse. But in terms of what the work that I do with Indigenous communities, I travel all over. I've been all over BC to about 20 different communities, introduced the concept of food sovereignty, had communities describe to me what that means to them. And it's very, very sacred, and there's been some main themes that I pulled out of all those conversations that we promote in terms of the sacredness of food, the participatory nature of food sovereignty. So we can't achieve food sovereignty if we're not actually engaged every day in practical participating in food-related activities. Self-determination, so being free from the corporate control of the food system, and oppressive colonial land and water and food policies. And then the policy Even though we know that food sovereignty is achieved through through the ground up. So it's what we're actually doing is actually more important than the policy. But the policy plays a role. So we need to be somewhat engaged in that conversation as well. So there is a growing movement. I've heard the number 200 million small-scale farmers, Indigenous people, fisher people. I don't know what the number Slow Food uses, but there is a huge global movement of small-scale, like I say, farmers and fisher people and Indigenous peoples that are mobilizing around the concept of food sovereignty. And they're not mobilizing around a political party, they're mobilizing around the issue. It's been estimated by La Via Campesina that about 70% of the world's food is grown by the 200 million people that are mobilizing around food sovereignty. So we have an incredible amount of power, but it's through the action and through the Indigenous paradigm, which is really a relationship-based. It's not a resource-based kind of paradigm where we exploit a resource for an external means. It's more based on healthy relationships to one another, to the land, the plants, the animals, and it's regenerative, not productionist. So there's tons of literature on this. I've done my research and I've heard the elders and the communities tell me this, and then I've gone out and researched it. So I'm interested in having that conversation. I could get into more detail, but maybe in the workshop this afternoon. But before I end, because I want to give the speakers a chance to speak as well, but I just want to say that there are some projects we're working on specifically that we can talk in more detail later. I'll just briefly tell you now. But so this year we'll be having our first Indigenous food gathering. So looking at, we've been researching models of, well, specifically the Mutual Aid Network, which is a growing movement down in the US. And they're looking at robust budgeting of other values other than money, recognizing that money is a part of our economy now, but it's a mixed economic strategy between developing the kind of financial intermediaries that could support more trading and sharing of Indigenous food, because that has always been what the Indigenous economy is. It still exists. We're still trading, we're still gifting. Gifting is a huge, it's almost impossible to put a dollar value on, say, wild salmon, because there's so many social, ceremonial, and cultural values that go beyond the monetary. So it's a little dangerous to start budgeting that, but there are people that have created these robust budgeting templates that look at other values. So we're going to start that conversation at our strategic meeting at the gathering this year in July at the BC Food Systems Network. And we're also going to be introducing an idea that we've been kind of educating funders about, and to get support to help us to look at when we, as like intermediaries, to kind of facilitate and promote more trading and sharing of food. That in that process, we're also mapping out those traditional trade networks and the traditional trade routes where some of the remaining fragments of our Indigenous biocultural heritage can be conserved. In the same way in BC here at least, and I know that it's not the same across Canada, but we have an agricultural land reserve system here that sets aside land for farming, but we have no land system that sets aside land for Indigenous food harvesting, like the hunting, the fishing, and the gathering. Anybody who studies sustainable agriculture and agroecology knows that the health of the farming is intimately interdependent on the health of the neighboring Indigenous food system. So there's some real good key points of complementarity in the ways we can work together to broaden the scope of the land conservation in terms of ecology, but also in terms of culture and in terms of the temporal, like a time scale. Because right now, sustainability planning happens at a very narrow, limited time that really isn't sustainable in and of itself. So we're also planning a wild salmon caravan because wild salmon is our most important indigenous food. And we don't, when I did my research and talked to a lot of at least Salish people that I spoke to, it was not a conversation, there was only a little bit of conversation about the monetary value, but more conversation about the social and the cultural values. So, and we know that traditionally the indigenous knowledge governance of the fisheries was highly sustainable. It's very sophisticated with knowledge on how to govern fisheries. And so the caravan's intention is to revitalize those intertribal relationships and knowledge systems around salmon, but also to raise awareness within all of society, the beauty of the story of wild salmon and what it gives to us. And so it's a celebration through the arts and the culture, and we'll be traveling from communities all the way from the headwaters of the Adams River and Mount Robson to Vancouver and Victoria for parades, and so stay tuned for that. And so that's, I probably went way over time.
That's okay.
Cook's Jam, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dawn. I just want to draw your attention to the program booklet that provides our panelists' biographies and their work and in their professional lives regarding food and indigenous food systems and community development. So thank you for your perspective. I'm always inspired and reminded of the amount of work that goes on with raising the awareness and the importance of Indigenous perspective, worldview, and contribution to good health. So I'd like to introduce Suzanne Johnson. I want to thank her for agreeing and to attend this conference. Suzanne is from our territory in the Okanagan and a member of the Okanagan Nation, and I'd like you to welcome her and hear what she is doing in terms of traditional knowledge and Indigenous food systems.
White Pasquaha, East Squeezed Tiku, Suzanne Johnson, Kintos and Pinkton, in Klaheklaha, East Squeezed Bob Nath Laura Johnson, East Amtima, East Squeezed Tui, Suzanne Tabasket Kruger, is Gahapa Squeeze Tui Joe Kruger. What I've done is give a portion of a formal introduction as we would do it in our way and in our language. And what I have to share is largely about learning and largely about healing. So my background is health. I'm a registered dietitian. I'm here to learn about slow food. I currently work with the First Nations Health Authority, and we had a little bit of an ongoing discussion for me to be able to come here because the First Nations Health Authority didn't know what slow food was, and there's really only one way to find out about anything that you don't know about is to go and explore and ask and learn. I've also been working in my home community since, I guess, 1999, when I kind of moved back after working as a clinical dietitian in Vancouver, moved back to the community and started working. And for me, it was largely driven by health, and Irene's talked about diabetes and a lot of the chronic illnesses that our community members face. And so I was there all eager to help and work with our people to learn to become healthier. And over time, various challenges came up in that work. The typical dietitian approach is, you know, you're going to eat these foods, and you know, these are the better foods for your heart. These are the better foods to help balance your blood sugars. But there's always barriers that come up for people to make changes. And you know, one of the first barriers was I can't afford fruits and vegetables. And then another barrier that came up is I'm not familiar with those foods. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to cook a fruit or a vegetable. And then another barrier that came up is, well, that's just not my food. Like, I don't know that, and it's not my food. Like, it took me a really long time to sort of understand why it was that in community, you know, at a feast, there'd be a lot of, you know, potato salad and macaroni salad and rice, like a lot of carbohydrate on the table. And you know, corn and carrots might have been vegetables. There's nothing green. And it came to me that part of that was a familiarity of what our traditional foods were. So we dug roots. Those were our vegetables. And it was really kind of the root vegetables that you would see on the table. And that there was some loss of knowledge. There were definitely people in the community who had the knowledge of the foods from the land, but just with those long-term intergenerational impacts, there was a lot of knowledge lost. And so my work in health has been largely in bringing, helping to bring that knowledge back. My family, my parents, my grandparents were really food strong. They were very food focused people, and it was everything. You went to town for flour, sugar, baking powder, salt. I think there were like 4 things they need to go to town for. They were beekeepers. They raised chickens, you know, pork. They had some fish. We lived by a lake just like this, and so there was the fishing. There was the drying of the fish. My grandmother was out digging roots in the spring. The kids were picking the berries through the summer. And the gardens, there was gardens, because we also live in a valley, not with as big a mountains as here, but a valley near Okanagan. And so the gardens were at different levels. So down on the valley floor we lived, there was a garden. Up a bit higher in the mountain, another garden. I think there were 3 levels of gardens. And just, I don't know who would have taken care of the gardens in the mountains, so they really kind of took care of themselves. And so in my work in our community health programs, part of what we decided to do and wanted to do was to bring our families back to that somehow, and to bring back the knowledge, because a lot of people just didn't know, and to bring back the fun of it, the sense of being together. Because we would, within my family ourselves, we would go to the mountains and go berry picking, and it was a little bit about getting the berries. We did our best, but it was mostly about that time together and working together. That's what food was about. So we started within our community. One of the community health programs is an Aboriginal Head Start, and we had a split model. So September to June was a preschool, and then the summer program was a family outreach component. And we did like a 3 to 4 day program, and we had 2 days that were a food focus. So we worked with the food. Food's kind of hard work. And then those who participated got to have fun on the 3rd day. And then it was like beach day or water slide day, or I don't know, go play mini golf or whatever. I wasn't actually involved in that part. I didn't get to have the fun. But that's okay, because for me, food is fun. So we would have, we'd have our gathering day, and we would go, you know, July and August, so we would go to the mountains and get the Saskatoon berries, get the soap berries, and bring them back. And depending on whether we could put them in cold storage or not. We work on the processing of them, the cleaning of them right away that day, or put them in the cold. And the second day would be the preserving day. And so then we would focus on all the different ways we knew to preserve. If it was canning, or if it was drying, or just freezing, the odd jam here and there. So we always had this one day out working, and we went to the orchards too. You know, we went and picked our own apricots, came back, canned them, made jam. However it was, we put the food away. And we had everything gathering, and it was like filling up the preschool portion. We had these shelves brought in and had a complete wall of everything that we put away. When it was time for salmon, we at that point when we were starting out early, we were using our family trade connections to get salmon from the Lytton area, I believe. And so we'd have salmon brought in. We worked with that. We had our cultural knowledge people as part of the program. So they would be showing us how to cut the fish. And then we worked on the safe way of preserving food in a modern method, which was pressure canning. So we were transferring all of these skills to our families. And at the end of the summer, we had our wall full of food, and we divvied it up. And we divvied it up based on who was doing the work. So if you were doing more work, you got to take a little bit more than someone who was there mostly slacking off on the food days and there for the fun days. Because that was sort of our way, right? You get out of life what you put into it. And so we were instilling some of those teachings too. And if there was, I remember there was we done it was actually one of the fun things I went to, we went camping as a group. And so one of the younger men, maybe, or one of our youth, maybe about 12, he was one who really, really helped out with everything, all the food, even though it's fruit and it's canning, and he's a boy. He really helped out lots, and at camp, he's the only one who helped me put up my tent. I was struggling away by myself. So he was just a really good helper, and so we'd pull out those individuals who were doing extra and really acknowledging them. And so that was the start of our learning with food, and bringing in that traditional foods component just a little bit, and really drawing from everything that was local for us. We then moved on to adding other things, so that family program continued, and we started tapping into things that the nation was doing as well. So things came up such as a fishing camp, a berry picking camp. This was kind of focused in health, so we would have our families join in on that if they could. Within our community, our school, which is a cultural school, it's working its way towards some level of language immersion. Within that circle of people, which were hunters, they were coordinating family hunting camps that we could go and participate in if we wanted. And the main part of that was it was a lot of gifting and sharing. So the hunters were there. Anyone, any single parent could come, an elder could come with their cooler to take some meat home, or to help with preserving of the food there and take some home. And a big portion of what was taken at the hunting camp was brought to the schools. So our schools had this opportunity for the majority of the year. The meats and the proteins that are served in our schools are all traditional proteins, be it moose or elk or deer. And that's the gifting from the hunters in these organized camps. We also were working on that community garden concept. And that was it was a struggle the first couple of years, because often those are based on a volunteer kind of model. And we're working with our families and our populations that are really struggling on a day-to-day basis. So that consistency of coming to help out wasn't always there. So we worked towards models where we had a main person in charge, where we had one person employed to take care of the garden and manage the harvesting and help with the distribution throughout the community. And that project has grown, and it's really neat because the gardening, the family that is sort of responsible for the garden, the main gardener, is their family history is that in that same spot where a community garden is now, when the settlers were coming, they were gardening in that area. They were very good at it, and they were doing their part to share and to feed the people. So our community was known for feeding the settlers because we were so good with our gardening in that one spot there. So our garden now is really quite plentiful. We've started to document the outcome from it, and it's anywhere from 11,000 pounds to 14,000 pounds. And this is a community effort. I can't even say it's my work because everyone's doing a part here from my community. But last year we have our young people working in the garden. And they're managing it. It's becoming their own, almost, we're working towards a bit of a sustainable business model because we're producing enough that the elders and the community members who want to come to access their produce the way they, as far as what they would like to have, they're able to come and access that. And we had extra when the fires were over in the boundary area. We had extra, and people came and we sent food over that way, based on our extras. So one of the things that we're working on next, and it's food sovereignty and it's building our local economy, is and it's creating that link between health and education, because we offer a meal program within our schools. And that is super strapped for funds, so we can provide the meat and potatoes, and the vegetables are really kind of hard to come by just based with the systems we have to work with. So one of our new coming projects is to create a root cellar, and then we can maximize what we're getting out of the garden, keep it longer, store it and have it available for the school. So that's building our own local food sustainability. And it leads into just the last piece I'm going to touch on is a project within the First Nations Health Authority, because everything that we do in our communities is for our children, and we have those Head Start programs, we have those daycare, preschool programs. Sometimes they're language nest immersion programs now. We have them in all of our communities across the province. But depending on those programs, whether or not they are choosing to be a licensed program or not, there's challenges and barriers to having traditional foods brought into those programs and have them served on a regular basis. So part of that learning and part of that healing and that revival and that reintroduction is creating the opportunity for exposure to our foods at a young age. And we have this barrier based on licensing. It's based on food safety issues. And so we're working on a project with a provincial project with the Provincial Health Services Association. And we're starting to explore what those barriers are. So we're bringing together environmental health officers who are the ones who would work with implementing and issuing food service permits, as well as licensing officers, and they're the ones who ensure that the buildings and the programs are safe for children. So creating those conversations to start to reduce those barriers. Some of the things that we found are that with environmental health officers that work on reserve in First Nations communities, they don't have as many concerns about the safety of traditional foods as an environmental health officer who works at an off-reserve site or works for the province. And part of that is that they haven't had the opportunity to have the conversation. They haven't had the opportunity to have conversation with traditional hunters and harvesters to understand that from an Indigenous perspective, probably at the highest level, our food is safe because hunters are trained from an early age, and there's a lot of training that's involved before you ever take a life, which is one of the most sacred things that you can do. So the safety is at a spiritual level, it's at a cultural level, it's at a knowledge level. And then all those practices that follow suiting that are, they meet the standards, but it's just that lack of knowledge. So that was just the last piece because that's kind of some new and exciting work. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne, for sharing your story and community experience and community development work, which is around food and food systems being central to our own livelihood and our own sustainability and community. The stories shared and the perspectives shared are quite diverse, as you've all heard, and appreciate the amount of work that is putting in to this issue of Indigenous food sovereignty, traditional wellness, traditional knowledge, and the sustainability of our planet and our health food systems. And so our final panelist, Deb, is here to wrap up the panel before questions and answers and share her perspective of her work.
Thanks. So I love food. And I would have to say that all I know about food I have learned from my mother, who is Cree, Métis, French. My father was Irish and Scottish, but we're not really sure because they kept fighting about it, so we're pretty sure they were Irish. My mother is 83, and she is my mentor, she is my hero, she is my best friend. She still hunts, she fishes, she traps when she gets invited, she downhill skis, she cross-country skis, she hikes, she gardens, she swims, she does yoga, she loves life. She retired, she actually worked in this building, she was a nurse. She retired as a OR emergency room nurse and never spent one day in school. It was all in the days when you could do on-job training. And she started off as a laundry room girl in Saskatoon. She's from northern Saskatchewan, from Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan. And so she worked her way up. So when we grew up here, so she came here early 50s. Met her husband, my dad, in the cusp, who was also from Saskatchewan. All good people are from Saskatchewan around here. But food was a huge part of our family. So we hunted. That was what we did. We lived off the land as far as our meat were concerned. We lived off the land for our vegetables was from the garden that my mom always had. Trade was a huge thing because the neighbors down the road had a huge garden to feed their family, but they also had the raspberry patch, so whatever we could share with them with the wild meat, because they didn't hunt, we got raspberries in return. The only part I didn't like is I had to go pick them. Still don't like picking raspberries. And I guess from living here and living and learning about our tunaha and our Shuswap ways is, and working so closely with the First Nations from this area, I learned how much they lost with residential school. So I guess sort of my perspective is as someone who is somewhat a teacher. I'm not a certified teacher, but I am a teacher. I spent 27 years in the school district working with our First Nations youth. Started off working with the special needs children, but then worked into an Aboriginal support worker. One of the things, you know, the big thing was to get these kids through school, get them graduated. But first of all, if you don't know who you are, you don't know where you're going. And that's what we're struggling with, not just here, across Canada. So our First Nations youth, yes, some of them are still getting to hunting, but when you live in a community that's really small, so our First Nations, our Shuswap First Nations only has 60 residents. We have about 140 members, but only 60 of them live on reserve because there isn't enough housing. Not because they don't want to live in their community, there just hasn't been any houses built in 30-something years. Same thing with Akiskanak First Nation. So we have, and they have about 100 more members living on reserve than the Shuswap Indian band does. So one of the things with our youth was to try and get them out on the land. And one of my most favorite days is a time that we went out on the land with an elder who's since passed, but Eva Joseph. And we went way down to Cranbrook. So there was 3 vehicles. And it was the most spiritual moment. I don't know how to explain it to you, but I had a van full of kids, and they wanted to know if we could listen to powwow music. So we put the tape in, and I was in the tapes, that was before CDs. And we had it just blasting, and I'll never forget, we were going down this road, and dust is coming beneath us, you know, and the kids are singing on top of their lungs. Kids that didn't even knew how to sing were singing. And we get out of the vehicles and we go, and Eva was so funny because she said, opened up the back of her car and she said, okay, do you wanna do this traditionally or do you wanna do it modern? And the kids are going, they didn't know what we were doing, neither did I. And so she pulls out an antler. She goes, this is tradition. And then she pulled out the tire wrench. This is modern. And it was to use as a digging tool. So we spent the day, we were picking Nakamsu, and we did Ayut. Then we went out and we spent the rest of the day at St. Mary's Lake where we picked cedar root and cedar boughs. And we talked about the sacred land. We talked about the connection. And I heard somebody else saying that before. Indigenous ways it's about connection. We're one with the land. And if we don't protect that, we're all gonna lose. So that would probably be my biggest thing for the youth, is that all of our youth, not just Indigenous students, but our youth don't know where food comes from. So we were lucky because we had the Swans, we had Alison Bell and some amazing people that pulled together the greenhouse project at David Thompson Secondary School and the community garden. So our students at our high school get to go down and they get to go check out lettuce, where the lettuce comes from, and they get fed that lettuce at the school. I would love to see that. When I heard you say wild meat, another elder that we spent a lot of time with was Phyllis Nicholas. And Phyllis is the one who taught us how to make huatskanal, which is dried meat, and to make Indian ice cream that we would make at the school. And I remember when we were having a big festival, and we had hunters that were going to give us elk meat, and we weren't allowed to use it because it didn't have that purple dye stamp on it. And I remember Phyllis looking, and she said, "What do you mean we can't use the elk meat?" I said, "We can't use it because the government says we can't use it because it hasn't got that purple stamp on it." And she goes, "We've been eating it for thousands of years. None of us got sick." You know, and so it's that mindset. Just because the government says, you know, it's kind of like that constant fight. It's a constant fight to do what we want to do that comes naturally to us. To be able to do it even, because we have all these rules. So that, I guess, is something that I would love to see change. When I think of food in the valley here and how much it's changed, because I'm getting old now, I think about when I was a child in this valley. We had fruit trees all over the place. Now, we couldn't grow peaches and apricots because that was over that side of the mountain. But we could grow tons of apples. Some people had small pears and some people had small plums, but they were far and few between. But apples grew really, really well here. Everybody had gardens. Nobody had fences. Times have changed. You can't have a garden in this town now because the deer. So the deer come into our valley. Now, we've ruined those deer. So as an Aboriginal, I look at that and I go, I get really upset because those aren't wild deer anymore. They become a nuisance, but I feel sorry for the deer because I honor the deer. They're important. But they're now eating on people's lawns that have got chemicals. They're eating out of shrubs that have got sprays on them. And even when, you know, they culled the deer, people said, well, you just sign up and you can get some deer meat. They came to the First Nations right away. Do you guys want these deer? So when I showed up at the village office to pay some taxes, they said, oh, are you here to get some deer? And I said, I wouldn't touch one of those with a 10-foot pole because they're not healthy. So when I think about we had Chinese people here in the 50s and 60s, huge gardens, and that's how they made their living, is by feeding other people in the community that couldn't garden or didn't want to. That's all changed. So it's huge changes, and that connection to the land and that connection to land is something that I think youth, we have to get the message to them. They have to be taught where their food comes from. And I feel sorry for the kids that live in the city, you know, because I think for them, they don't have that opportunity like, say, our kids do, where we can go out and see an elk and see a moose or see a deer. I don't really know what else to say because you guys give such a different perspective, but I just, my son is a hunter. We always say that my husband and I saw Bambi, so we don't hunt, but my son, it was innate in him. From the time that kid was like 2 years old, everything was, and so I thought, okay, well, I was raised with guns, so we better teach him the right way. And so he is the one who's harvested for us since he was 4 years old. He was 4 when he got his first harvest, which was a chicken. He was 10 when he got his elk. He was 12 when he got his moose. So he has fed us from a very young age. And he has that respect to the land, because it isn't about the kill. Some people will say hunters are killer. Well, no, a true hunter is a harvester. It's no different than going out in the garden and picking what you've raised and you worked for. He's worked for that elk. He got up at 4 o'clock in the mountain and he climbed the top of that mountain before the sun rose. And then he waited and he tried and he asked permission to take that animal's life. And that animal gave permission for him to take it. And he shares that with not just his family, but other people. The person that maybe helped bring it down, the person that he was riding in the truck with, or whatever. But it's shared. Same in our First Nations communities. You will never see somebody just go out, harvest a deer, and bring it home just for them. They harvest it, they take what they maybe need for that night's meal, and they'll share the rest. And I think we've lost that concept too of sharing. So I honor what you guys are doing. I can tell, I can feel that there's a wealth of knowledge in this room at a total different level than I could ever speak to. But I want to say that I think as somebody who's Métis, I'm sad that my people were part of the history of the destroying the buffalo. It's the one part of my history that I'm not proud of. I am the president of the local Métis Association here, and I can say from Métis Nation British Columbia, and this is something that I've been trying to talk to both bands about actually, is Métis Nation British Columbia is doing a mapping program. And they're mapping all the different areas that the Métis people have been harvesting from. So, of course, you know how they're hunted. They don't want to say their perfect spot where they got that elk, but it's a general mapping to document the areas. So we're trying to establish, like, there are food source areas that shouldn't be touched because they've historically been used. And I really think that that's an area that First Nations need to do as well. Yeah, I think so, because it's pretty impressive. I just saw it in Vancouver just before Christmas, and it was amazing. And I just think that's something that we need to go toward, because these valleys and stuff, it's just not just about the logging. There's lots of other stuff happening there. I did bring a couple just artifacts because I worked in a school and you have to have visual too. So buffalo sinew, these are called wolf willow, and this is pretty much across Canada. It's called wolf willow or silverberry bush, and inside here are these little seeds, and those seeds were probably the first beads that before, like, pre-contact. These were found on my dad's family farm. This is a tomahawk, I guess you'd call it, but it was basically for breaking the bones of the buffalo. This is my favorite. So thousands of years old. So that was used to pound the berries. My mom remembers using this with her grandmother. So our old ways aren't that far away. The knowledge is here. Just ask, I guess.
White limb to Irene, Dawn, Suzanne, and Deb for sharing your perspective, sharing your knowledge, sharing your insights, your family stories. That's something that is very common amongst us all, is our family histories in which our knowledge is based, and which brings out the diversity and the contribution that we all make in terms of why our lands and the spaces we occupy are so sacred to us. The shared meaning of that is, I think, the underlying message that I heard this morning. The meaning of that knowledge and those stories in terms of relationship with the land, with our environment, and most of all with each other as peoples. And those values of sharing, those values of seeing food and other things as sacred, the importance of ritual and ceremony and custom, that's inherently part of us and ingrained in our psyche, in which we grew up in those families that taught us that understanding and meaning. And I think in terms of the purpose and the intent of the panel, it's important and for me to recognize Slow Foods and the organizers of the conference on launching the AGA formally with opening with this panel, and I want to thank you all for that, because inherent to that is, by that act alone, is given the and recognizing and respecting the contribution and the reality of Indigenous peoples in their homelands and in their territories, in their communities and in their families, and in which food systems grew and that knowledge was understood and practiced. So with that, time, Allison, how much time do we have?
Just over 20 minutes for questions.
Okay, great, thank you for that. And with that, I'd like to open the floor with any questions, reflections, comments of any of the panelists or in general.
Hi, how's it going?
Okay.
Sure. Now, this question is just for Suzanne. You mentioned that you're a dietary dietitian for the Aboriginal communities.
Yeah.
Obviously, type 2 diabetes is at an epidemic rate right now. What other kind of issues are you dealing with in your current role as a dietitian?
It's really, it's type 2 diabetes, it's chronic disease. Health from a holistic perspective, and it all ties into connection to land and physical activity and working with food. So those are kind of the areas I've been focused in. But health is certainly, there's the intergenerational trauma. A lot of that is mental health aspects.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's all really interconnected, right?
Yes.
You can start to take care of your physical, and that's going to help you be in a better position to work with your more mental hurts. So it's almost across the board. It's pretty well. There is a gap in health status between British Columbians and First Nations in BC, and that's one of the main focuses of First Nations Health Authority is to reduce that gap.
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment on that because what brought me to my work was my personal healing journey, overcoming the trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder that was passed on in my family through the residential school, but also addictions and mental health issues that I experienced, and diabetes and other food-related cardiovascular illness that I experienced. I'm still experiencing it, but I've come a long way because of the work on food sovereignty, but a lot of that is stress. Like, I'm still coming to more fully realize my energy and how it's connected to my gut and how integrated it is with my work. So I've had some good conversations here about that, but I can speak to that personally, the trauma and the stress, the memories of that in our body, but also the powerful healing that comes with the ancestral memories in our body when we come to more fully realize the medicine in that, right? So.
Any comments? Any other questions? You want to use the mic? Okay, great.
Thank you for a very, very interesting presentation. I'm just wondering if any one of the panelists could comment on language and food systems, because it seems that I heard residential schools come up several times, and we all understand that it's been a struggle to keep languages flourishing largely because of that. And I'm just wondering if anyone could comment on what you're doing to restore and maintain languages and how important that is for food, Aboriginal food systems.
Thank you for that question. So our languages. So when I explain this to students about how important language is, and this is how I do it. So I say, okay, so we learn the alphabet, and those letters make words, those words make sentences, those sentences make paragraphs, and those paragraphs tell a story. In Aboriginal languages, sometimes one word is the story. So if we lose that word, or we lose that knowledge keeper, that word is gone forever. Particularly in this area. I can speak, Marguerite, with respect for the Tanaha. The Tanaha is one of, it's 11 isolate or 13 isolate, I can't remember, never remember that number, isolate languages in the whole world. So if you, with being such a small First Nation, how do you keep that language alive? It's not taught in the schools. There's not enough money to bring a teacher in. Been there, done that, tried that. We have very limited elders that have survived even from residential school. Particularly after the residential school payment, we lost a huge amount of our elders because they had been waiting their whole life thinking that this would make it better, and it didn't. And they died. Huge amount. It was forecasted by people that work with residential school. Money doesn't make you happy. Healing does. So the languages, for me, after working in the school for this long, it's so important, but it is the one thing that I really am having a hard time believing we're going to be able to keep. So just because I think when I first started working in the Tanaha Nation had 23 language speakers, and I believe they're down to 9. So once those 9 elders are gone, even though we have people that are trying to learn it, they're still not at that level where those elders originally were because it was wiped out because of residential school. So those little words, those historical sites, those historical stories, like most Indigenous creation stories they're not something that is just taught like in an hour. It's something that was taught over weeks. Sometimes more than weeks, because it encompassed everything, their whole life. So the language is super, super important to have documented and have that understanding, because sometimes just that one word is the whole story.
I always feel like I have so much to add, but I want to give other people an opportunity to comment too. But this is a really important one, and I really appreciate Deb, how she's emphasized the local languages here. There is a project called TerraLingua. They have a website, and you can go on there, and it maps out the language diversity around the world, and it overlays it with the ecological diversity. It shows that language diversity is connected to biological diversity, unquestionable link. So the diversity in Indigenous, there's 8 of the 11 major Aboriginal language groups in Canada exist in BC. There's 27 nations of Indigenous peoples in so-called BC, like within the colonial boundaries of BC. Really, within BC, it's an international reality because there are so many Indigenous tribes that have never surrendered our sovereign national status. So, but that's the political part, but that's also connected. The socio-political realities of Indigenous peoples here is connected to conserving our language. But to that effect, there's so much, as Deb says, richness in the sophisticated knowledge within our languages. And, but language, the issue of language is also related to the decolonizing process around how we talk about the food system in the English language even. I hear the word producer being used a lot to describe the work you do. My feeling is that it's not that the fact that you're farming I'm not judging that. What I do judge is the perpetuation of a paradigm that was instituted in the Industrial Revolution to mathematically calculate the spirit and the Indigenous language and culture out of the food system. That's what the production paradigm has done. It's led to the political specialization, which led to the colonial expansion of people. The longer we continue to use that languaging of producer, consumer, distributor, the more we're going to perpetuate and be entrenched into this unsustainable mindset. So if we could start to think, I mean, the beautiful gift of Indigenous languages and cultures is that we tell stories. And we have a rich narrative and a very high context communication pattern. Western science has conditioned us to be cut to the chase, be facts oriented, be quick, and there's a really low context to that. And I'm proposing that we change our language, even within the English language, and how we talk about what we do, to give that richer story and stop calling ourselves producers. Start calling ourselves, like, naming the activity and describing it. Like the Indigenous, my language, we can't even, like, there's a whole term, like, there could be a whole story in one word, but there can be a whole long story to what one word in the English language might mean. So I'm just saying that because it challenges us to start to think differently about the words we use to talk and the story we tell. We're changing the narrative here, and we're doing it together across cultures, and that means a change in language. So I'm just really passionate about that. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
With regards to language in the whole process of it, for my community, I guess within the Cree Nation, we have a Cree school board. And within there, we've managed to establish a regional vocational training center, which has allowed us to give professional cooking classes. However, the professional cooking teacher is not a Native person, but this person has integrated himself into the community and has come to see the importance of traditional cuisine. And he has learned the language with regards to culinary terms, traditional foods, and so forth. And when he's teaching, he uses the traditional names, and he talks about this importance that you ask about, of respecting the traditional names of these foods so that future generations can learn to respect the cultural component of the foods. Because there's that gap that truly does exist. And you hear about it today, the residential school effects. And we'll continue to hear about it. It's a heavy subject, but it's a reality that does exist, and it's only going to be with time that it's going to be reduced. So this teacher talks about the importance of respecting the Cree language in culinary terms. So then when he's preparing food, he is not allowed to prepare traditional foods in the school system because it has to have that stamp. So he has gotten a shed built, so he has to work in a shed to teach the people their own traditional food systems. So again, this is about the colonization again that does exist, and we need to act now to preserve the cultural component, the culinary component of our culture. We can't wait until we are able to break through policy so that we can begin teaching our younger generation the traditional way of cooking, a rabbit over an open fire and so forth and things like that. So he needed to improvise so that he can incorporate it into the system. So it's a very important component, and it does a lot more than just preserving the traditional foods. It helps the healing process. So it has a very important role. The language used around foods is a very important component that needs to be included when talking about food sovereignty.
Suzanne?
I was going to share just a little bit to add to that. I guess I'm in the process of, I'm like a 18-month-old learning how to speak the language. And so just some reflection on that. In our cultural way, we talk about like different levels of knowing, and it's kind of like a spiral that you go through. So you can be at a very early stage of just knowing what. And it's that incorporating the language and learning the language that you go deeper into, the so what, the when, the why, what's the cultural teaching that goes with that. And so that's a piece that, like, the language is key, because that's the view through which you learn about your culture and learn everything there is to know about, a certain food or medicine. When are you going to be able to look for it? When are you going to know to go and get it? How will you know what type of terrain to look for it at? Because it isn't just going to be one spot. It isn't going to be one particular time that you go for that. And then just in that process of learning language, kind of relating to what Dawn was mentioning about our English language and thinking about that. When we're trying to translate, it's really difficult, and one of the things that we're encouraged to do is when we want to translate an English word, what does that word mean to you? So that one word, it could have pieces of different meaning, and in the Inquilitan language end up being a very long word as you try to put it together. But it's really coming to the root of what does that mean to you. And even in English, just, for us, one word can have many different meanings. So it's a whole another depth and layer to the learning.
Well, with that, I think that question, I thank you for asking the question about the importance of Indigenous language, because it's embedded in our the meaning of our Indigenous food systems and our relationship to good health and wellness and relationships with our environment and our land and resources. And with that, we are at the end of our first morning panel, and I'd like to ask you all to once again give a hand to our panelists for their wonderful knowledge